Yokoso owashitare. Welcome back. And oh boy, I am excited for today's story because we are finally in the section of stories that deal with one of the most well-known aspects of Japanese history, the samurai. Well, okay, technically at this time they weren't referred to as samurai. Not one single instance in any of these stories have I seen that term used to describe the warriors, but it is a story about warriors. They wore similar kinds of armor, used the same kind of weapons, and these are the progenitors of the modern samurai. So ultimately, are they warriors? Are they samurai? That's a little bit of a pedantic semantics, as it were. So I'm just going to call them samurai, even though just keep in the back of your mind that that's not what they called them at this time. Regardless, I am very excited. And one more item of business. This story that we are covering today was actually a historical event that happened. And it was a big event, a very important occurrence that happened that changed Japanese history. And so, for the first time, we are going to be splitting this story up into 3 parts, because it is long and it is significant. And that way we can at least have videos at a manageable length. So without further ado, let's get into our story. Once upon a time, imawa mukashi. During the reign of the retired Emperor Suzaku-in, in the eastern countries, there was a man by the name of Taira no Masakado. And he wasn't just a man, but he was a warrior. A tsuwamono is the term that they use here. And he was the son of a man by the name of Taira no Yoshimochi, a man who was appointed as the Chinjufu shogun. The Chinjufu being the government military outpost in the northwest part of Japan, which was at that time considered wild and backcountry and on the frontier. And so, Yoshimochi, being the shogun, was the head commander. Now this was different from the Seitai shogun, which will come to be known throughout Japanese history as the number 1 position for warriors to have. But Taira no Yoshimochi was himself a descendant of the Takamochi Shinno, which was the Prince Takamochi, who was the grandson of the Kashiwara Emperor, also known more commonly in history as Emperor Kammu. So that is all to say that Taira no Masakado had within himself imperial blood. He was 5 generations removed from an emperor, and one of the most important emperors in history at that. But Taira no Masakado dwelt in the provinces of Hitachi and Shimosa, which again were in the eastern part of the country. It's actually where I live now. I live in the place that was formerly Hitachi province, and Shimosa was nearby here as well. I believe there were 8 provinces that were known for being the eastern provinces, and these were largely occupied and controlled by the warriors. And so Masakado lived in Hitachi and Shimosa, and he made his living by surrounding himself with many strong, stalwart warriors, and by means of the bow and arrow, engaged in war. He was expert in it. Second to none, one of the best in the country. And one point of note is that at this time, the warriors, the samurai, were not really associated with the katana, with swordsmanship. Instead, they were associated with horseback riding, and more particularly, the use of the Japanese bow and arrow. And in all of these stories, whenever they refer to the weapons of choice that the samurai used, it is always the bow and arrow. But, as luck would have it, Masakado's father, Yoshimochi, passed away. And when his father passed away, a bit of a dispute arose between Masakado and his uncle, his dad's brother, Yoshikane. And the different sources don't agree as to what the nature of the dispute was. Some say that it had something to do with marriage ties or a broken marriage vow or something like that. This story specifically says that after Masakado's father died, there was a land dispute about the rice fields and who possessed them that arose between these 2 men. And things almost broke out into war, because again, that is how Masakado did things. That's how he conducted himself. He was a warrior, first and foremost. But according to the story, his uncle Yoshikane had no desire for war and actually ended up entering the Buddhist priesthood. And so by becoming a priest, he expressed to his nephew that he did not want to fight and that he did not want to cause any trouble. And thus, war was averted this time. However, Masakado was a warrior, and that's how he gained his living, was through fighting. And thus, he traveled all around the eastern provinces, fighting, pillaging, plundering. and his actions caused many innocent people's homes to be burned, and many other innocents lost their lives. And the people in all the surrounding provinces bemoaned their fate, and even began to forget how to tend to their crops because they were so focused on trying to defend themselves and escaping the forces of Masakado. And of course, because of all of this disruption, none of the official imperial business could get done either. If the people weren't planting and tending to their crops because they were being killed or driven away, well, then that means that the emperor is not getting his taxes, and that means that the imperial authority is not being exercised or looked after, that the order is not being upheld. And the cries of the people grew so great, and many of them banded together and they sent a letter to the emperor explaining the situation, detailing the exploits of Taira no Masakado and how they were suffering under him and his warriors. And when the emperor heard this, he was astonished and surprised. Now what this story doesn't mention is that Taira no Masakado had actually spent time in the imperial capital before, and so he was a known name in the capital. He wasn't just some nobody that cropped up out of nowhere. Again, he was of imperial descent, fairly far back, mind you, but he was still imperial. And so, when the emperor heard about how Masakado was going around and just pillaging and destroying and causing all of this chaos, he was surprised. And so immediately he sent out official summons and he called Masakado to the capital to come and give an account of what was going on. Essentially, this was a trial, and Masakado was expected to speak for himself. And Masakado, as soon as he got these summons, immediately and dutifully went straight to the capital and went to the emperor and attended his own trial. And there he put before the emperor his case. Many, many times he stressed, "This is not my fault," and he explained why. And after much deliberation, the emperor and his advisors all came to the conclusion that Masakado was not at fault, that he was innocent of the accusations leveled against him. And after taking a few days to wrap up the final conclusions of the trial, Masakado eventually went back home to the provinces in the east. But after his return, it didn't take long for things to get violent again. Masakado's old disputes with his uncle came up yet again. But this time, Masakado managed to persuade two stalwart warriors from another warrior clan to join his cause, Minamoto no Mamoru and Minamoto no Tasuku. Names you won't have to remember, but the point is that over time, Masakado began amassing even more allies to his cause. More and more warriors were joining under his banner to fight for him. But although he was gaining allies, he was also making enemies. Because one of his cousins, Taira no Sadamori, that is a name you will have to remember, Sadamori. And maybe I'll just call him Cousin Sadamori so we can keep things straight. But Cousin Sadamori was at the time working in the capital when a lot of this was going down. But during his fighting out in the eastern provinces, Masakado had ended up killing his cousin's dad, aka his uncle, Taira no Kunika. And sorry again, there's a lot of family names, there's a lot of names I'm throwing at you, but this was an actual historical event with lots of people, and they were all part of different clans, they had all these different connections. This was war, and many, many people were involved. So Masakado ended up killing his own uncle, not the uncle that he had the dispute with before, but a different uncle. And this caused cousin Sadamori to turn against his cousin, to turn against Masakado. However, he was still in the capital and he still had a duty, a term that he was fulfilling in the service of the emperor. But his service ended, and as soon as it was ended, he immediately went out east to go confront Masakado and bring him to justice. The only problem was, cousin Sadamori was just one man, and he did not have the manpower and the allegiances and the alliance of other warriors like Masakado did. So even though he managed to make it back out to his home in the east, there wasn't much he could do, and so he just went into hiding, and he bided his time, and he waited. And again, cousin Sadamori is a name that you are going to have to remember because he features very prominently later in the story. And here comes the first big break in the rebellion of Taira no Masakado. Because up until now, largely things had been local disputes, disputes among the family, disputes among the warriors. The capital wasn't particularly concerned with what was going on, as if this was just something that warriors kind of did. They just fought each other. But in the province of Musashi, which was one of these other eastern provinces, ruled largely by warriors, there was a man by the name of Okio no O, or Okio no Shin-O. Basically, the last part of his name meant that he was an imperial prince. And he was an imperial prince much more closely related to an emperor than Masakado was. He was either a grandson or even a son of an emperor. But the thing about being an imperial prince is that there were many imperial princes. The emperors very often had lots and lots of children. And so, especially if you were an imperial prince by a secondary wife or a concubine even, your prospects for advancement weren't actually very great. And so, very likely, this Okio no Shin-O, this Okio no O, decided to go out east to make a name for himself among the warriors. And he was appointed not quite as the provincial governor of Musashi. He was appointed as kind of like a secondary position. He wasn't quite the governor, but he wanted to be. And he also found himself becoming very good friends with our guy, Masakado. And so, with the most prominent warrior in the country at his back, Okio no O went and he forcibly ousted the governor of Musashi and took the title for himself. He appointed himself not secondary provincial governor, but first provincial governor. Now when this happened, there were people who were not happy about it. Specifically, the Gunji. Gunji being like a district manager, one of the Gunji. He came to Okio no O and complained that this was unprecedented. This was out of the ordinary. This was not okay. You should be ashamed of yourself, sir. You are not the properly appointed governor of this province. Harumph, I say. But the thing about it is Okio no O had Taira no Masakado at his back. And so, who was really in charge here? And so Okio no O just told this district manager off. Said, get out of here. I don't want to hear anything from you. And now suddenly realizing the position that he was in, that he didn't want to go toe-to-toe with the most prominent warrior of all of Japan at the time, he immediately skedaddled on out of there and went into hiding. But there was another man who witnessed all of this, and who also was not particularly happy about it, because it was unprecedented and unofficial. A man by the name of Minamoto no Tsunemoto. And he too was a warrior, but he was also smart enough not to immediately march up to Okio no O and demand that he resign and that he take back everything that he did. So instead, he went in secret to the capital and came bearing these reports of everything that had happened with Okio no O and Taira no Masakado. And he came to the emperor and laid everything before the emperor, and explaining that Taira no Masakado and Okio no O had raised the standard of rebellion, that they were in open revolt against the government. And again, this was all news to the emperor. He had already determined that Masakado was guiltless of many of the charges that had come before. So he was, again, surprised, like, oh no, was I wrong? Was Masakado actually a bad guy this whole time? And he sent a decree out demanding answers from Masakado. And Masakado, once again, dutifully responded. This time he didn't go to the capital, but he wrote a letter, and along with that letter, he sent official declarations from the various governors of these eastern provinces that all attested to Masakado's guiltlessness in this instance. So not only is Masakado explaining himself very well, but he is getting other very prominent, very powerful people to vouch for him. This is not Masakado's fault. And so, when all of these documents reached the emperor, he was once again surprised, but in a different way. Because did this not prove Masakado's innocence? And he was once again satisfied, and this time he was even more impressed with Masakado. Like, wow, his deportment is so upstanding that even all of these powerful men were on his side. However, the emperor would one day come to rue his decisions and take back his high opinion of Masakado, because things in the east were not well, and things were starting to come apart, and chaos was growing. So that's where I'm going to end the story for now, because again, this is going to be a three-parter. But I do want to point out a couple of things. When you read this story, it is very much trying to paint Masakado as the bad guy. I didn't know exactly how to translate this in the previous portion of the story, but it does specifically say that when Masakado made his living through war, it does use the term akugyo, which means evil deeds. And it doesn't explain exactly why Masakado was constantly fighting his family and the people in the eastern countries. It just simply says that he did. However, I'm very skeptical of this criticism of Masakado, because as you can see, twice he proved his innocence before the emperor, and the emperor was more than happy to say, okay, you know what, you're in the right here. I see nothing wrong. And not only that, but he was able to amass many followers to his cause. But unfortunately for Masakado, he ended up overplaying his hand, and it cost him very dearly, which you will see in the next videos that will be coming out. So please, if you enjoyed this story, like the video, and if you want to stay in the loop for when these other videos come out and the story continues, please subscribe to the channel. And of course, if you have any questions for me about the language, the culture, feel free to let me know in the comments, and I'm going to thank you for your view. Ito kateji ke no koso haberi kere. And hopefully we will see you in the next one in about a week for part 2 of the rebellion of Taira no Masakado, the first samurai. Okay, so we will see you then. Adios.